Hey, pull up a chair. We're so glad to have you join us here on the Back Porch Education Podcast. For the next half hour or so, we're going to talk about all things educational. It's a wonderful day to learn something. Glad you could join us.
Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. It's the Back Porch Podcast. We're back, and we're going to change it up, everybody. Steve picked the poem today, and so Steve's going to read the poem. Steve, what have we got? I'm pumped.
Yeah, D.H. Lawrence, that fine, noble Christian, wrote a poem simply entitled Listening, which hopefully
Good.
is what we'll all be doing for the next few minutes. I listed to the stillness of you, my dear, among it all. I feel your silence touch my words as I talk, and take them in thrall. My words fly off a forge the length of a spark. I see the night sky easily sip them up in the dark. The lark sings loud and glad, yet I am not loath that silence should take the song and the bird and lose them both. A train goes roaring south, the steam flag flying. I see the stealthy shadow of silence alongside going. And off the forge of the world, whirling in the draught of life, go sparks of myriad people, filling the night with strife. Yet they never change the darkness or blench it with noise. Alone on the perfect silence, the stars are boys. Honestly, don't know if that last word should be boys or buoys. I didn't grow up.
I don't know. I feel like
Noise
you kind
and
of
boys.
smush it.
It's got to rhyme with noise.
Make it rhyme. Exactly.
And I, of course, chose it because it's such an uplifting poem.
Well, it's reflective. Yeah, I like it. I don't know a ton about D.H. Lawrence, but I do like this one.
Yeah. So I chose it because we're taking on a pretty big bite today. We've entitled this, "What is the Educational Bare Minimum?" Which would sound like a short, small, basic, easy episode for us, but it's really a big bite.
Yeah.
I have long started my time with my students by trying to set this in front of them as sort of, why are you in my class? It's funny that I have to defend the study of English, but most students enter my class assuming they already know the subject.
Right.
And they also enter my class firmly convinced that they'll never need this stuff ever again. It has nothing to do with the good life. It has to do with getting a diploma. So I've got to start off trying to defend the legitimacy of them spending an hour a day, 5 days a week with me for a year, or potentially for 4 years, depending on the school and the city. They're going to be in English class for the 4 years of high school, and here's why we require it of you. But where I want to start today is even earlier in the show than my defense of English class. It really kind of starts with the difference between an art and a skill, which is something we've mentioned before. We've sort of toyed with it a little bit, but I thought we'd start there today and kind of pull that out more fully. You want to take a stab at that, Jason, and do a little defining for us here between an art and a skill and what's going on there?
Sure. So, but I'm also going to lean on you because I know it gets, I think by context or in different contexts, it gets thrown around a lot of different ways. Okay. So, but let's start. An art sometimes is like defined as a skill. But here we're trying to make a distinction. And so as I understand it, an art is more rooted in purpose, or like, um, okay, so I'm thinking of Aristotle and his attempt to practice an art, right? And the higher the art, um, like the more noble it is, and the noblest arts are those things that you would do for no other reason than the fact that they're worth doing in and of
Yep, I think
themselves.
you're right at the crux of the subtle but very clear distinction. An art
Okay.
an art is done for itself. It is of itself a good thing. A
Hmm.
skill is something I learn so that I can get to some other end. One is an
Hmm.
act of love,
Okay, good.
the art, and the other is an act, I would say, maybe it's too far to say of power, but of manipulation, or
Yeah.
I'm doing this.
Sometimes even
Well, yeah,
weaponization,
I'm
I would
doing this
say.
that I might get what I want, as opposed to in doing it, I get what I want. So
Hmm. I don't know how much we want to dive into this, but it strikes me now, just as we're talking, um, that maybe a good way, sort of offhand, to define it is, um, like, arts are an attempt to submit to something like better, um, like
yep.
the good, the true, the beautiful, and a skill would be something that you practice in an attempt to assert
Yeah, one of
dominance
the
over
books that we
something.
need to implore our listeners to read is David Hicks's wonderful Norms and Nobility, and in that work he talks a great deal
Yeah.
about the change that came over Western man when the ancients sought out the arts that they might live appropriately within nature. They were trying
Hmm.
to enter into the way things are and be happy in nature. And at some point,
Yeah.
you can call it the Enlightenment if you want, but I'm reticent to give it that much credit. At some point, man decided, wouldn't it
Right.
be better if we tried to bend nature to fit us? And that's, I think,
Hmm.
opened the door for guys like Dewey, et cetera, to come in and almost, well, to recreate the term skill, to no longer be, because I love the world in the way it is, I'm seeking to learn how to live within it happily, to, because I want to be happy, I'm developing the skills necessary to gain that happiness, however I can make that happen. I'm setting
Right.
all this in place because I do believe that education, what we're trying to do, especially in my realm of high school, but of course it's completely dependent upon the job being well done for me, kindergarten through eighth grade before they get to high school, is it can be narrowed down to the four basic skills of reading, listening, writing, and speaking. And that's the crux of our episode today.
Hmm.
But back behind those are the more classic frame of the liberal arts. In particular, what I'm emphasizing when I talk about those four skills, reading and writing, listening and speaking, are the trivium, the three liberal arts of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, working with words. But
Hmm.
but that's what we do so often is we hear that today and we think these are subjects we need to teach in school. Mm, by teaching subjects, our students are growing in the arts of working with word and working with number. They can be taught as a subject, yes, but we're a
Right.
much more fundamental, uh, less explicit idea,
Hmm.
and that's That's a big deal.
Well, it's a different kind of thing, right? It's like it's I don't know, people talk about the difference between form and content, right? A lot, and it's not an exact match, but I do think there is this push for those who would even recognize the liberal arts. I think there is this push, maybe from misunderstanding, or maybe another reason, but an attempt to um, make the trivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric, to make those things content, but it's
Right.
not exactly. I mean, you can talk about the content of that, but it's a more of a form thing. It's a how, it's a doing, right? Not an object of study, as much of a mode of
Right.
study.
It becomes more obvious when you take just one of those, grammar.
Mhm.
There is a grammar to grammar. You got to know what a verb is. You got to know what a participle is, so on and so forth. There's vocabulary. There's factual information about how words work. But
Yeah.
we certainly don't consider someone capable with grammar who just knows all the terminology. And we could
Exactly.
do this with any. I know the difference between a paintbrush and a X-Acto knife, but that doesn't make me an artist. That just means I know some of the terminology, some of the equipment. And so
Right.
then it moves into the connection of those grammatical pieces, those individual word definitions start making sense when we start connecting them. That's the logic of things. But even there, that's sort of like book knowledge. It's the
Hmm.
rhetorical, it's the useful, the embodiment of that knowledge that starts making it move from just something I know to something I am, right?
Right.
And so when you become the kind of person that thinks grammatically, that orders words without effort, so to speak, or orders it so easily because you're so familiar with it, it's become a love of yours, and it's now you couldn't speak grammatically incorrectly because it's not who you
Mm.
are. That's moved from, hey, I'm going to learn this thing so I can make a lot of money, to I've radically changed who I fundamentally am. And
Right.
that to me is where we get excited with the notion of wisdom and virtue and the definitions we put out of education previously. That's really why we're driving at this. And so when I sat and thought, Mortimer Adler came along and kind of helped me fill in these blanks. What is it when I'm teaching English, or when I'm teaching math, or when I'm teaching science, or when I'm teaching boat building? What is it? What's the bare minimum? What does a
Hmm.
student need to walk away from an education with? And of course, I don't believe anyone ever walks away from education, but formal education, what is it trying to do? And Adler
Yeah.
said, at least for the humanities, at least on the side of words, this is it. Somebody that can read and write, listen and speak is set. I hear all the time about marketable skills. Dewey wanted the skills of a good citizen. I can't think of four more fundamental necessary things than being able to
Right.
communicate effectively, both orally and in written form. There it is. That's the bare minimum in my mind. Hey, during this brief break, I wanted to encourage you to use the share buttons we have on our website in order to help us get folks tuned into the show. Our goal is to encourage as many educators, homeschoolers, NFL punters, and donut makers as we can with these podcasts. So help us get the word out. Share our Facebook page, send folks a link to one of your favorite episodes. Do whatever you can to help us share this craziness with either your best friends, or, if it's more appropriate, your worst enemies. We will love you all the more for sharing our love. Thanks. And now, back to the show.
All right, Steve. So oh crap. I stole my own thunder. All right, Steve. So reading, writing, listening, speaking. Those are the four arts. well, arts. Yeah, I guess we'll say arts.
Arts or skills,
Or
I don't mind either. I think that
yeah,
the distinction, if a student has come to be in love with those four things because they know how to do them well and because they've done
then the
them,
art. Good.
yeah, then it's art. That's right.
Okay, I gotcha. So maybe reading starts as a skill but becomes an art when you practice it because you love it, rather than because you have an assignment due in the next half hour or
Right.
something.
See,
So,
and
okay, cool. So
that's one of the
go
things.
ahead.
That's one of the things that kind of cracks me up is I get condemned all the time about being impractical. So if the heart of education is wisdom and virtue, is this really all you need? Reading, writing, listening, and speaking? Well, yeah. That'll
Yes.
get you to wisdom and virtue faster than any other skills in the boat. But if the heart of education, as many people define it, is preparing to make as much money as I can and grab all the power I can get and be the very best me in America that I can be, are these four things the essential bare minimum? Well, emphatically, yes. If you're a really good persuasive
Yeah.
communicator, you're going to make a lot of money potentially. I mean,
That's
if you
right.
look at what people are trying to hire, they want people who could communicate. Geez, can I go this far and say they want people that can think?
Yeah, and exactly. So that's what I'm thinking, is so key, right? Thinking is the skill or the art that undergirds all four of these things. You might even say that reading, writing, listening, and speaking are the four like ways of expressing um, your thinking. Although I don't know, I think there are some pretty interesting scholars out there who are like doing work in terms of like saying things like writing isn't like you don't sit down and write what you think. You sit down, you start writing, and you're thinking as you are writing. And through the process of writing, you actually do some good thinking that you could not have done without that. Right. So,
Yeah, I think it's a
in
chicken and the egg
right,
argument. It probably starts with thought, but certainly writing makes you think a lot more clearly.
right. And so, I couldn't find I couldn't find the guy who said it, unfortunately. But in one of my readings for one of my classes that I'm in, there was this guy who said, sort of in response to the blowback that he was getting as a writing teacher, he sort of quipped this saying that I just think is absolutely fantastic. His response was, we are not trying to produce better writing. We're trying to produce better writers, right? So whether or not some draft that one of my students makes is better or worse than some standard that you have, that matters less to me than whether or not my student is becoming a better writer. That is, whether my student is becoming a better thinker.
Yeah. Yep.
Right. So it's got to be. I just love that distinction, and I think it's so helpful because for Steve, we're a couple of humanities guys, but it's every bit as true on the other side, right? I'm not trying to produce better experiment results. I'm trying to produce better experimenters.
Right.
I don't want more correct math answers. I want better mathematicians.
Right. Right.
And it changes the focus from the product that the student is producing, which there is this whole like you will be judged by your fruit thing that we would definitely not deny. But eventually, like that's going to come. What we need to be focusing on, though, as teachers, is not an artifact that they're producing, but our primary focus needs to be on the cultivation of the student.
Right.
Sorry for the rant, but I
No,
think
no,
that's
no. That's right where I'm at. So I've literally told my students at times who have fussed a little bit about all the long flowing red rivers of ink in my handing back to them what they thought was an A paper, and there's all this
Mhm.
red. Mr. Elliott, you hated my paper. I did not. I would never invest this much time and effort.
Exactly.
I'll tell you what happened.
Right.
If you want the red rivers of ink to slow down anyway, be pedantic. Just
Mhm.
find some facts. I would hope you dress them up a little bit, but just spew off a nice logical train of facts for me. I'll probably not have much to say about that. But as
Right.
soon
If
as
it's dead, I'll be dead.
right, if as soon as you go moral, as soon as you start acting in your writing as though you care about what's true and good and beautiful, I'm going to get into what you're saying. And
Mhm.
then as
Mhm.
a teacher, I know it's my job to try and help you say it even better. In
Yeah.
part because I want to understand the beauty and truth and goodness that you're talking about.
Yeah. So another guy that I've been reading for class, his name is Peter Elbow,
No, it
and
isn't.
he's like this. What's that?
That's really his name.
Peter Elbow. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. So he's he's like a like composition and rhetoric sort of guy, and he's like way a giant in the field. But he says this thing, and I think it's super helpful. Maybe you would pass it on to your students. Um, like he writing that he doesn't like, he doesn't critique, and he doesn't know how to critique. It's sort of like, ugh, I don't really know. Like I don't even know where to start. But stuff that he really likes, he said that he finds himself critiquing that more. Why? Because he thinks it's worse? No, because he wants to interact with it, because he's enjoying it. Like, oh, great, we're doing something here, right? So that's like, hey, kid, take heart. I invested some time in this because I
Right.
like what you're doing.
Right. Right. And um right, it's brought me in. You've excited me as opposed to
Yeah,
bored me.
I'm hooked.
Right. Um
Yeah, right.
and it's funny to me how many students fuss about the boring nature of English class, and they're the ones doing it to themselves. You know, if they just get a little jazzed about
Right.
some aspect of God's amazing creation, I often try to make sure that what they're writing about is as much as I can stand to do it, their choice, not my choice. One, when you walk in and say,
Right.
okay, here's everybody's prompt, then you've got 30 of the same essay to read, and that's God bless
Mm.
numbers 28, 29, and 30, because they're going to get nothing from me. But um but beyond that, it's them as well, right? This is the horse and water issue. If
Sure.
they're given something they don't care about, they're not going to think about it much, and they're not going to write about it all that interestingly. Or
Right.
this is the beauty of seminar for me is I teach a class every day in which we just sit and talk, but we just sit and talk about we today finished up Aristotle's Politics, right? So that
Nice.
it's compelling. I mean, he's got the stuff there. I don't have to do anything to jazz it up. I got to make them read it, and they're less than
Mhm,
happy about
mhm.
that. But once they get in it, and then they come into class, oh, I got a lot to say today, Mr. Elliott. Well, great. Make sure everybody else gets a chance too. But it's funny that many of my fellow teachers are scared to death of ever being asked to teach that class, and I just smile and say it's the easiest. It's the easiest gig in town. I just show up, and they do all the talking. I
Mhm.
occasionally have to call them down off the walls or whatnot, but they're engaged.
Sure.
This stuff matters.
See, art.
And
That's art. Like they at that point, they are writing, maybe writing's the hardest one to do, and maybe reading's the second hardest, but they are listening and speaking to one another about something. They're after it. Like, they're doing it for its sake.
Yep.
At that time in that class, when everything's firing on all cylinders, they're not thinking about how winning or losing this argument is going to affect my yearly salary down the road, but they are invested in the topic and they are thinking about the topic. And that is the educational bare minimum. Like,
Right.
that's, and in a lot of ways, that's the end of education too. Like, that's what we're after.
Right. They're in love. I don't know how
Right.
to say it any more simply than they're in love with the truth.
Exactly.
And they're running around after it instead of running around after an A. And
Yeah.
I'd much rather be in that room than in the other room where they're all hound dogging the A. While this show is a back porch discussion, it does cost a little bit of money. So if you're liking what you hear, consider helping us out. You can simply use the donation button on the website to send along a one-time gift, or we have subscriber plans for those who want to commit to regular support. Subscribers can get premium rewards depending on how nice a chair you pull up on the porch. We have everywhere from sitting on the floor to our finest rocking chair available. But whatever you can do, know that it helps us keep the conversation going. And for that, we heartily thank you.
Okay, so let's talk about cultivating these arts. Let's talk about trying to get students to practice reading, listening, speaking, writing for their own sake, and to really own those skills and like practice them because they love them. I think I want to start with listening because it's probably the skill or the art that that students are most comfortable doing. Like, it's the thing that's done the most in most classes. And I would say, sure, if you're a teacher, everybody likes to beat up on lecture, and I think that that's for a good reason. There's a lot of bad lecturers out there, um, and there's a lot of people that are lecturing poorly. There is something redeemable about it. We've met people who are just, man, that guy or that gal can like really put a speech together and communicate some information. Great, but let's move beyond that too. Let's talk about other ways to cultivate that skill. One of my personal favorites, nobody will be surprised, is reading poetry to students. And one of the primary reasons I think it's a good thing is because it's difficult. Man, that's like, okay, it's rhyming. You can kind of get lost in the sing-songy stuff sometimes.
Yeah.
You can kind of, it's just hard. And that's why it's a good thing to do, right? When you are able to digest that, it's a good thing. So even though it is difficult, that's a really great art to develop because it is pleasant once you have attained a certain level of competency.
Yeah, I think there's a benefit in most folks today have a pretty strong grasp on physical health. They
Yep.
understand you go to the gym, you got to work up a sweat, you got to push it, feel the burn, no pain, no gain, all this. And then we won't translate that to mental or intellectual muscle.
Mm-hmm.
That
Mm-hmm.
that it's the hard stuff that makes us better. And
That's
there's a
right.
real movement in education today to bring the stuff down to the easy level for students. And I think that is why there's a direct correlation in my mind anyway between that and lowered performance. That they're just not able to handle the tough stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And um when I talk to students and they complain about, it was 5 pages long. This is too long, Mr. Elliott. And I'm like, 5 pages? Seriously? Come on, man.
Right.
But they're used to the
Right.
3 paragraphs, and then we start asking questions. This
Yeah. Milk and meat.
Right,
Right.
right. And so with listening, reading, speaking, and writing, here's what I'll say. To the extent that you integrate those 4 things, not as an exercise, but as the way in which class happens, that
Mhm.
class, whatever history, any humanities class, but I believe this is true even, let's just take Spanish class for a moment. You're really not conversant in Spanish until you can converse in it. And that means
Sure.
being able to read it and at some point write it, in part to prove that you can read it.
Mhm.
And of course, listening to others speak it, understanding what they're saying, and then being able to open up your mouth and lo and behold, Spanish pours out. The concept, the atmosphere, let's use that term, the atmosphere
Good.
of the classroom must be one that loves language. And when a student has to feel free and safe and able to read and make mistakes.
Good.
I read this, you assigned it to me, but I didn't get it. Okay, great. That's much better
Right.
than you coming in saying, I understood this perfectly. Nothing happening here. What's next?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And that's why seminar in particular, we take on the big dudes. I'm really excited for the students because they're about to start Augustine's Confessions. They're not going to like it. I don't like it.
Sure.
It's freaking hard.
Yeah, it is.
And we don't read it because it's so cool. I mean, it's a guy confessing his sins. There's, I guess, a Jerry Springer-esque kind of engagement to that. But we read it because it's good for us, not because it makes me feel good.
Right.
That distinction, and especially Augustine. I see this with Aquinas. Dante has the double whammy. I'm reading I can't read Italian, so I'm reading a translation of poetry. Dante will get you both with you're reading a translation and it's poetry, and he's got all this symbolism. So he's bringing a lot to the table when you're reading it. Of course, we then need to talk about it with other people, listen to their ideas about what it said, and even if we want to think more clearly about it, start putting some of our thoughts down into writing and getting the clarity that comes with doing that. So I make sure that when a student's in my classroom, they feel the weight of choosing their words carefully. They know that if they say something off the cuff, I'm not going to let them get away with it. I'm going to make them examine it. Maybe that needs to be restated. Did you mean this or that? And I'm not trying to build paranoia, and I don't think my students feel paranoid. They're cautious.
Right.
Just like when I'm on the treadmill, I don't just suddenly stop or I'd shoot off the back end of the thing. There's a safe way to use this machinery in the gym. I'm trying to give them that kind of respect for words because I think our society has taught them to just throw words around and see what happens. And who needs a big vocabulary? One word will fit the gap of 10 or 15 different words.
Right.
And I'm trying to push them away from that. And so they
Good.
know that when that's going on in class, there's got to be that awareness of what they're doing with language.
Yeah, and I think that awareness is sharpened by the interconnectedness of these 4 arts, right?
Right.
Of these 4 modes. So, like, something that is pretty useful, I think, to teachers would be, I think we get protective of our subject matter, and so a kid comes in and said, "Man, this was dumb." Okay, fine, right? And what we want to say is, "How could you? It's anything but dumb. This is amazing." But perhaps a different tack is perhaps a more effective one would be to say, "Okay, so you read this and you didn't like it. Okay, cool. Talk to me about that,
Yep.
right? Or write about that. Or okay, I'm lecturing, or I'm I know it happened with poetry all the time when I was reading it. I'd read poetry, Mr. Dolworth, are you kidding me? you know, and I'd
And he's
say,
quoting
hey,
me, by the way.
right, yeah, right. I'd say, hey, come on, right. Tell me about why you didn't like that. Um, or maybe a kid, you talk to him after class, hey man, what's going on? You haven't been saying much. I don't know what to say. Okay. Well, have you been doing the readings? Right? Like, if you don't know what to say, read more or listen more, or like these things, it's all input output, but it's all wrapped up into a ball,
Yeah.
and so it's really densely connected.
Well, and there is a personality issue in play, especially with the speaking and listening. There are people that, for various reasons, don't say much in class.
That's right.
My goal is always just to make sure it isn't because I've built a culture that's unsafe for them to speak, uh, and
Hmm.
and and then from there, I'm very much like a coach. If I get a player in a sport who's never played before, I don't start as though they've been here for years and know all the skills. We start, in the old Vince Lombardi example. This is a football, and just
Right.
start from play one or skill one, and like you were saying, it's a pretty basic. What do you agree or disagree with the author?
Hmm.
Rarely do I have a student. So I have a different problem on my hands if a student says, "Well, I don't know, I don't care."
Yeah, that's not the same. I agree.
That's to me a moral issue. You got to have a side on.
Hmm.
So by purposely choosing in the humanities, choosing whether it's literature or history, philosophy, theology, etc., we're dealing in morals. We're dealing in good choice, bad choice. So
Right.
so it can be pretty personal. Hey, person that doesn't want to talk, do you think he should have done that? No.
Hmm.
Why? And now they've got to let out a little bit of the reasoning, and
Hmm.
and it can be baby steps. And when they give you a reason or two, of course, some power mouth over there is going to want to run off with it,
Sure.
and that's not necessarily wrong. They've just rescued their poor, quiet friend from having to say more,
Right.
but they've spoken and they've been a part of it.
Yeah.
And the amazing thing to me is if it's really worth talking about, sooner or later everybody gets sucked in.
Yep.
The big questions. That's why I love the philosophy course. We all care about being human. We don't all think about it
Hmm.
equally amounts, but then so you bring in Aristotle in the room, and he's thought a lot about it, and he starts throwing around. We just had this today where some kid basically says, "Mr. Elliot, do I understand Aristotle to be saying that basically all of life's relationships are political?" And I said, the way he's using that term, yes. The way we use it today with elections and promises made but not kept,
Right.
no. But what he means by political, yes. And in fact, an
Hmm.
act of maturity is to move past the idealism of youth that wants to have no politics in life to the mature understanding that every time I open my mouth, every time I go out in society, every time I relate to any other person, it's to some extent political. So yeah, and
Hmm.
baby steps. That's what I got to constantly remind myself is baby steps. But um, I think it's valuable for them to read each other's writing. I think it's valuable for them to be reading really stuff that's above their head so that they're aspiring to write like that. I think it's really important
Hmm.
that there's lots of true conversation, not me asking a baited question, getting desired response, asking another.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's lame.
I mean,
That's just a more intricate or confused version of like information passing along,
yeah.
right? Like whatever. That's Yeah,
really
that's
low
fine.
on Bloom's taxonomy, which we have a whole episode on at some point, I'm sure.
Yeah. All right, dude. I think that does it for us. I'll catch you next time.
Well, thanks again for joining us in this great conversation about education. We hope you will not just listen, but participate. Leave us a comment, suggestion, or thought on our website. You just never know when we'll use it on the show. Until next time, pursue joy and learn something.